All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we try to turn you on to some great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, cosmologies, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries. And hopefully you can use these things for benefit in your life, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your shifting of paradigms. And today is our fifth installment of reading from the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception. And this is just part of the overall unit, which is called Reciprocal Church, where we're going to try to whip up a kind of a gumbo, religious gumbo, spiritual gumbo for replacement of our discredited religions here in the West. So we will be kind of discrediting those religions at the same time as constructing something to put in its place, in their place. We are about to start chapter 2 of this book called The International Team. And just the basic background, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in Qumran, about 20 miles from Jerusalem in 1947. And they were a bunch of scrolls hidden in little jars, in caves, and most likely they'd been planted there about 68 AD when the Romans were sieging Qumran. And then the documents are somewhere from 200 BC to 1st century AD to 68 AD. And that is kind of a crucial question. When were these documents from? But there are many documents that contained Old Testament books, almost in their entirety the same as the Old Testament books that were known at the time. I believe there's a copy in the Dead Sea Scrolls of every single book of the Old Testament except for one. And there's a lot of other material about the group that put these scrolls together, who were apparently living there at Qumran. So that's just now the deception part, the Dead Sea Scrolls deception is having to do with basically divulging the information and the scrolls. The scrolls are written in Hebrew, and I believe some of them are in Aramaic. And they, you know, you can't just figure out what they say unless you're kind of an expert on it. So there's a lot of biblical scholars and so on that kind of swooped in. This all this takes forever. This is 20 years just to kind of like get them to where people are even aware that they're out there, you know. And so that's where we're going to start here, is the international team. This is the team that's kind of formed under the auspices of, we're going to get to the bottom of this. We're going to study all these, everybody's going to get an assignment that they are supposed to publish a book about, and so on. Okay. Yigal Yadin recounted the events of 1967 to David Price Jones in an interview conducted early in 1968. He was aware, he said, that other scrolls were around, that Kondo, the dealer involved in the original discovery, knew where they were. He therefore sent other staff members from Hebrew University. accompanied by 3 officers to Kondo's house in Bethlehem. Kondo was taken under escort to Tel Aviv. When he emerged after 5 days of interrogation, he took the officers back to his home and produced a scroll, which had been hidden there for 6 years. This proved to be an extremely important discovery, the Temple Scroll, first published in 1977. Price Jones also interviewed Father DeVoe, who was highly indignant at what had occurred. According to Price Jones, DeVoe called the Israelis Nazis. His face flushed as he claimed the Israelis would use the conquest of Jerusalem as a pretext to move all the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Rockefeller and house them in their shrine of the book. He also feared for both his own position and his access to the Qumran text, because as Price Jones discovered, Father DeVoe had refused to allow any Jews to work on the scrolls in the Rockefeller. Okay, so this Rockefeller is located in what was called Transjordan on the, I guess, the Jordanian side of half of Jerusalem before the establishment of Israel, and then the Israelis at some point took it over. I think actually it was in the 6-Day War. That's what he says. DeVoe's fears, in fact, proved groundless. In the political and military aftermath of the 6-Day War, the Israelis had other matters on their plate. Yadin and Professor Baran, who from 1961 to 74 was director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, were therefore prepared to maintain the status quo, and DeVoe was left in charge of the scrolls, with the stipulation that their publication be speeded up. A cache of some 800 scrolls had been discovered in Cave 4 in 1952. To deal with the sheer quantity of this material, an international committee of scholars had been formed, each member of which was assigned certain specific texts for study, interpretation, translation, and eventual publication. Owing nominal allegiance to the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, the committee in reality functioned under the virtually supreme authority of Father DeVoe. He subsequently became editor-in-chief of the definitive series on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the multi-volume Discoveries in the Judean Desert, published by Oxford University Press. He was to retain his prominence in the field until his death in 1971. Roland DeVoe was born in Paris in 1903 and studied for the priesthood between 1925 and 28 at the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, learning Arabic and Aramaic in the process. In 1929, he joined the Dominican order, under whose auspices he was sent to the École Biblique in Jerusalem. He began teaching regularly at the École in 1934 and served as its editor from 1945 until 1965. Between 1938 and 1953, he edited the École's magazine, Revue Biblique. To those who met or knew him, DeVoe was a striking and memorable personality, something of a character. A heavy smoker, he wore a bushy beard, glasses, and a dark beret. He also invariably wore his white monk's robes, even on excavations. Charismatic man, known for his vigor and enthusiasm, he was an eloquent lecturer and an engaging raconteur, with a flair for public relations. This made him an ideal spokesman for the enterprise on which he was engaged. One of his former colleagues described him to us as a good scholar, if not a particularly good archaeologist. But behind his personable facade, Devoe was ruthless, narrow-minded, bigoted, and fiercely vindictive. Politically, he was decidedly right-wing. In his youth, he had been a member of the Action Franchise, like, I guess, like the vote, franchise. The militant Catholic and nationalist movement which burgeoned in France between the two world wars, which extolled the cult of blood and soil, expressed more than a little sympathy for the dictatorships in Germany, Italy, and on Franco's triumph, Spain. Certainly he was ill-suited to preside over research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, that's the beginning of the next paragraph, but I would just say that, you know, this whole kind of where he sits politically, I just pretty much discount that at this point, you know, because I've just heard so much propaganda about people who are allegedly, you know, this or that, dictators or tyrants or whatever. You know, it's just kind of a way to smear somebody. And like, I don't, you know, it may or may, and same with even racist, right? You know, bigoted and vindictive. It's all just kind of a smear, and it's not really believable. It could be true for sure, but I just very much, that kind of description, I kind of really discount it. I mean, it's in my mind that it's been said, but it doesn't have a whole lot of weight. Certainly, he was ill-suited to preside over research on the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the first place, he was not just a practicing Catholic, but also a monk, and this could hardly conduce to balance or impartiality in his handling of extremely sensitive, even explosive religious material. Moreover, he was hostile to Israel as a political entity, always referring to the country as Palestine. On a more personal level, he was also anti-Semitic. One of his former colleagues testifies to his resentment at Israelis attending his lectures. After interviewing Devoe, David Price Jones stated that, quote, "I found him an irascible brute, slightly potty too." This is all just kind of a smear. It's kind of like hair pulling. According to Megan Broshi, currently director of the Israeli Shrine of the Book, Devoe was a rabid anti-Semite and rabid anti-Israeli, but was the best partner one could ask for. This was the man, then, to whom responsibility for the Dead Sea Scrolls was entrusted. In 1953, the Board of Trustees of the Rockefeller Museum, whose president at the time was Devoe himself, had requested nominations from the various foreign archaeological schools, British, French, German, and American, then active in Jerusalem. No Israelis were invited, despite the proximity of the well-trained staff of Hebrew University. Each school was asked for funds to help sustain the cost of the work. The first scholar to be appointed under Devoe's authority was Professor Frank Cross, then associated with McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago and with the Albright Institute in Jerusalem. Cross was the Albright nominee and began to work in Jerusalem in the summer of 1953. The material assigned to him consisted of specifically biblical texts, scroll commentaries, that is, found in Cave 4 at Qumran, on the various books of the Old Testament. Material of a similar nature was assigned to Monsignor Patrick Skehan, also from the United States. At the time of his appointment, he was director of the Albright Institute. Father Jean Starkey from France was nominated by the École Biblique. At the time, he was attached to the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. Starkey, an expert in Aramaic, was assigned the corpus of material in that language. Dr. Klaus Huno Hunzinger was nominated by the Germans. He was assigned one particular text known as the War Scroll, as well as a body of material transcribed on papyrus rather than on parchment. He subsequently left the team and was eventually replaced by another French priest, Father Maurice Ballier, or Ballier. Father Joseph Milik, a Polish priest resettled in France, was another nominee of the École Biblique, with which he was also affiliated. A disciple and close confidant of DeVoe, Milik received an especially important corpus of material. It included a quantity of Old Testament apocrypha. It also included pseudepigraphical writings, texts in which a later commentary would try to impart authority to his words by ascribing them to earlier prophets and patriarchs. Most important of all, it included what was called sectarian material, materials pertaining specifically to the community at Qumran, their teachings, rituals, and disciplines. So this guy, Malik, he got a lot of the very important material. The sectarian material turned out to be the most important stuff. The Apocrypha as well. And what else did he get? He got yeah, I guess that's also the pseudepigraphical writings. But this guy is also, he's a Dominican priest there with, along with DeVoe. So there's a bunch of Dominicans that are involved here with deciphering these things. Now, this next person seems to be, and is portrayed in here, as being really the only honest broker that's involved. The British nominee to the team was John M. Allegro, then working for his doctorate at Oxford under Professor Godfrey R. Driver. Allegro went to Jerusalem as an agnostic. He was the only member of the team not to have a specific religious affiliations. He was also the only philologist in the group and already had 5 publications to his credit in academic journals. He was thus the only one to have established a reputation for himself before working on the scrolls. All these other people are like priests and stuff. So this could be part of the author's bias toward, biblical scholars, but it could also have a lot of weight. He was the only one to have established a reputation for himself before working on the scrolls. All the others were unknown at the time and made their names only through their work with the texts assigned them. Allegro was assigned biblical commentaries, which proved in fact to be sectarian material of the kind assigned to Malik, and a body of, I think that's like the Habakkuk commentary, stuff like that, where the Qumran people are making commentary on Old Testament text, but in doing so, they reveal a lot of their sectarian, their habits, whatever the sect is active in. And a body of so-called wisdom literature, hymns, psalms, sermons, and exhortations of a moral and poetic character. Allegro's material seems to have been rather more explosive than anyone at the time had anticipated, and he himself was something of a maverick. He had certainly no compunction about breaking the consensus DeVoe was trying to establish, and as we shall see, was soon to be ousted from the team and replaced by John Strugnell, also enrolled in a doctoral program at Oxford. Struniel became a disciple of Frank Cross. According to what principles was the material divided, distributed, and assigned? How was it determined who would deal with what? Professor Cross, when asked this question on the telephone, replied that the matter was resolved with discussion and easy consensus and with the blessing of DeVoe. Quote, certain things were obvious. Those of us who had full-time professorships could not take unknown and more complex problems. So we took biblical, the simplest material from the point of view of identification of material, and putting stuff into columns and whatnot. The people who were specialists in Aramaic, particularly Starkey, obviously the Aramaic stuff went to him. The interests of the several scholars, the opportunities for research pretty much laid out what each of us would do. This was quickly agreed to, and DeVoe gave his blessing. We didn't sit down and vote, and there was no conflict in this. Basically, the team worked by consensus, end quote. Professor Cross makes it clear that each member of the team knew what all the others were doing. All the material had been laid out and arranged in a single room, the scrollery, and anyone was free to wander about and see how his colleagues were progressing. They would also, of course, help one another on problems requiring one or another's individual special expertise. But this also meant that if any one of the team were dealing with controversial or explosive material, all the others would know. On this basis, Allegro, to the end of his life, was to insist that important and controversial material was being withheld, or at least delayed in its release by his colleagues. Another independent-minded scholar who later became involved reports that he was in the 1960s instructed, quote, to go slow, to proceed in a deliberately desultory fashion, quote, so that the crazies will get tired and go away. DeVoe wanted, so far as it was possible, to avoid embarrassing the Christian establishment. Some of the Qumran material was clearly deemed capable of doing precisely that. Just as a footnote, he puts the scrollery was a large room containing some 20 trestle tables where scroll fragments were pressed under sheets of glass. Photographs dating from the 1950s show a complete and appalling lack of any environmental control for the material, much of which was already deteriorating. Windows are open, for example, curtains blowing in the breeze. No attempt has been made to exclude heat, humidity, wind, dust, or direct sunlight. It is a far cry from the conditions in which the scrolls are housed today. They are now in a basement room under a special amber light. Temperature and humidity are rigorously controlled. Each fragment is held between sheets of thin silk stretched in perspex frames. It was certainly convenient for DeVoe that until 1967, the Rockefeller Museum lay in the Jordanian territory of East Jerusalem. Israelis were forbidden to cross into the sector, and this provided the anti-Semitic DeVoe with a handy pretext to exclude Israeli experts, even though his team of international scholars was supposed, at least theoretically, to reflect the widest diversity of interests and approaches. If politics kept the Israelis out of East Jerusalem, they could easily have been provided with photographs or with some other access to the material. No such access was granted. We raised the issue with Professor Biran, governor of the Israeli sector of Jerusalem at the time and subsequently director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities. He stated that the Jordanian authorities had been adamant in refusing to let Suknik or any other Israeli scholar enter their sector of Jerusalem. In his capacity of governor, Biran had replied by authorizing DeVoe's committee to meet in the Israeli sector and offering them safe conducts. The offer was refused. Biran then suggested that individual scrolls or fragments be brought over to be examined by Israeli experts. This suggestion was similarly rejected. Of course, they could have come, Professor Biran concluded, but they felt that they had possession of the scrolls and would not let anyone else take them. End quote. In the existing political climate, the scrolls were a fairly low priority, and no official pressure was brought to bear on this academic intransigence. The situation was rendered even more absurd by the fact that the Israelis, first at Hebrew University and then at the specially created Shrine of the Book, had 7 important scrolls of their own. The 3 originally purchased by Sukenik and the 4 Yigal Yadin managed to purchase in New York. The Israelis seem to have pursued and published their research more or less responsibly. They were, after all, accountable to Yadin and Biran, to the government, to public opinion, and the academic world in general. But the team at the Rockefeller emerged in a rather less favorable light. Funded by substantial donations, enjoying time, leisure, and freedom, they conveyed the impression of an exclusive club, a self-proclaimed elite, almost medieval in their attitude to and their monopolization of the material. The scrollery in which they conducted their research has a quasi-monastic atmosphere about it. One is reminded again of the sequestration of learning in the name of the rose. And the experts granted access to the scrollery arrogated such power and prestige to themselves that outsiders were easily convinced of the justness of their attitude. As Professor James B. Robinson, who was director of the find for the Nag Hammadi texts, which were the more gospel, all the kind of apocryphal gospel texts that were found in 1945 in Egypt. And as he said, quote, manuscript discoveries bring out the worst instincts in otherwise normal scholars. End quote. If the international team were high-handed in monopolizing their material, they were no less so in interpreting it. In 1954, just when the team were beginning their work, the dangers had already been anticipated by a Jesuit scholar, Robert North. Quote, regarding the date of the scrolls, or rather the triple date of their composition, transcription, and storage, there has recently attained a relative consensus, which is both reassuring and disquieting. It is reassuring insofar as it proceeds from such a variety of converging lines of evidence and provides a working hypothesis as basis of discussion. But there is danger of a false security. It is important to emphasize the frailty of the evidences themselves. End quote. North's warnings were to be ignored. During the course of the subsequent decade, a, quote, consensus view, to use the term and Robert Eisenman's, his term and Robert Eisenman's, was indeed to emerge or be imposed by the international team working under DeVoe at the Rockefeller. A rigid orthodoxy of interpretation evolved, from which any deviation was tantamount to heresy. This orthodox of interpretation, which grew progressively by more dogmatic over the years, was enunciated in its entirety by Father Malik and published in France in 1957 under the title Dizaines des découvertes dans le désert de Juda. 2 years later, Malik's work was to be translated into English by another member of DeVoe's international team, John Stroniel. By that time, the first English formulation of the consensus view had already appeared. The Ancient Library of Qumran by Professor Frank Cross, Struniel's mentor in 1958. The consensus view was summarized and given its final polishing touches by Father DeVoe himself in a series of lectures given to the British Academy in 1959 and published in 1961 as L'Archéologie et les manuscrits de la mer morte. And by then, its tenets were soundly entrenched. Anyone who presumed to challenge them did so at severe risk to his credibility. Okay, one more paragraph. In 1971, on Father DeVoe's death, an extraordinary situation developed. Although he did not, in any legal sense, own the scrolls, he nevertheless bequeathed his rights to them to one of his colleagues, Father Pierre Benoit, another Dominican, and subsequently DeVoe's successor as head of the international team and of the École Biblique. For Father Benoit to actually inherit DeVoe's rights, privileges, and prerogatives of access and control was, as a scholastic procedure, unprecedented. From a legal point of view, it was, to say the least, extremely irregular. More extraordinary still, however, the scholarly world did not contest this transaction. When we asked Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago why so dubious a procedure was allowed to occur, he replied that opposing it would have been a lost cause. That is brutal. He dies, and so he bequeaths his scrolls to whoever he wants. That is ridiculous, in my opinion. So anyway, we will take over tomorrow where we left off today. And please come back. In the meantime, have a great